Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 111th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this episode, I'd like to discuss the topic of emotions and why emotions are so important, and why they often run under the radar, and run our lives without us even knowing. So, one thing that is clear from our current society is that it's a highly mental society. Some people call it scientific, rational, but let's just examine in very simple terms what the mental is. One clairvoyant that I really like says that the mental is what gives form, what gives a form to something. So, what that means is that if our reality, the underlying reality, is just vibrations interacting with each other, you can give those vibrations that interaction, you can give it a whole number of different forms. It's, for instance, let's take the example of the piano. The piano is a technical form that you give as to be an intermediary between the underlying reality, that is vibrations, and interacting and producing those vibrations via the piano as a form, as a physical sort of intermediary. But you can also use a flute, you can use all kinds of different forms to interact with vibrations. And what gets us confused is that we think that it's the form that is important and not the underlying reality. And that's where we are completely wrong. That is, the fact that the music is pleasing or not to our ears has nothing to do with the color of your piano, for instance. Whether it's white or black, or whether it's a stand-up piano, a straight piano, or a grand piano. It has to do with the underlying sound that is produced by the piano. That is ultimately the test of whether it's nice or not. And so you can have plenty of different forms or ways or interfaces that you superpose upon a reality that is made up of pure vibrations. For instance, you can have the monotheist form, the polytheism, the animism, all kinds of isms, basically, all kinds of paradigms, all kinds of models for interpreting and interacting with reality. For instance, like American Indians and talking with spirits and all that stuff. Those are just forms that you give vibrations in order to interact with them in a more practical way. Just like, for instance, you name and separate things and you give names to things so you can interact with them. But ultimately, what is the real test is how you feel. Once you interact with reality, how you feel, not the form that you use. Just like it doesn't matter what musical instrument you play, that's not what's important. What is important is the sound that comes out of it and whether it sort of enters in harmony with other instruments, or whether the sound that comes out of it is pleasing, not the instrument itself. And that is the big confusion, is that we think that science and rational thought is the only valid form, and it is the form that is going to allow us to determine what we should or shouldn't do in our reality. That is what's called rational thinking. Whereas in the opposite, it's actually the opposite. Like science and the rational mind is just a way to structure reality, but the way to navigate through it is always based on emotions. And that is something that most people are completely blind to, including myself for a very long time, and still am in some ways, because it's very hard for me to connect to my emotions when you haven't done it for a very long time, it's just something that you're not accustomed to doing. One of the biggest questions I fear is when somebody asks me, "How do you feel?" And I just stare. I'm okay. I don't know. Fine, I guess. It's a really difficult question for me to answer, as opposed to all kinds of theoretical questions about the universe. So, emotions. And this is very simple to understand if you really think about it, if you really feel about it, let's say. And some people make fun of this, saying that instead of people saying I think, they say I feel. And that is a tragedy because then we're no longer on the same wavelength. But that was never the case. Whenever you said I think, you were actually meaning to say I feel, but you use I think instead of I feel just to, how should I say? Well, first of all, to disguise your emotional state, to hide it because it's not deemed correct to sort of throw your emotions at people's faces. And the second thing is when you use this rational thinking, it's a way to seize power over the other person. Because when you give yourself what you're saying, the aura of objectivity, that you're objective, that you're not subjective, you're talking about an objective reality, something real, something true, something factual, something, um, then it's a way to sort of impose your thinking, but actually your feeling on another person by saying, I think instead of I feel. But when you say I feel, it's always you're admitting your subjectivity. You're admitting that you're actually it's the way you feel, and that is personal to you and has nothing to do with how the other person feels necessarily. And that also exposes you to how should I say, being not understood or recognized. Oops. Or isolated, or feeling like you're not part, like you're not belong, like you don't belong. Because when you say I think, since that kind of a way of talking is a way to take power over people and sort of press your way of thinking upon them, or your way of feeling upon them, you're sure that going you're kind of securing the fact that you're not going to feel alone. You're not going to feel abandoned and the only one thinking or feeling in a certain way. And that is the big tragedy. Like when you have a tribe of chimps, if one of the chimps always feels at odds with how the rest of the tribe feels, at some point that's going to be really, really painful for that individual, let's say. And the same for humans. We really strive to belong, and we strive so much to belong, we make it a survival issue that we want all other people to feel like we feel, and therefore we created all kinds of strategies and mind games in order to make sure that everybody feels alike when under the guise that everybody thinks alike. For instance, monotheism is one way to sort of think about reality, but also, especially, to feel about reality. That is the fear of a God that is going to punish you if you do something bad. That is a way to harmonize feeling, and then you might trick yourself into thinking that it's harmonizing the way you think, but it's actually harmonizing the way you feel. For instance, having the same fears, the same apprehensions, the same willingness to engage in an activity and unwillingness to engage in others. For instance, the same willingness to worship the same God and at the same church, and the unwillingness to, say, commit theft, for instance. But that is all about feeling, because without the emotions, all of that is just falls flat. And this is what's really important to understand. For instance, imagine if we were just purely thinking machines. Try to imagine that. We're computers, we're just basic computers. Well, in that kind of world, it would have been a long time ago that we would have committed suicide. That is, any rational mind can look at what's happening today with the limits of the scientific and rational mind, of course, and what the scientific materialism brings in terms of the limits of the form that it gives reality, it's all the scientists, most scientists are actually unanimous that climate change is unavoidable, that demographics is a big issue because we're going to sort of eat the whole world up, that natural resources are declining, that we're harming all kinds of things, ecosystems, whatever. Okay, sure, we're also doing a lot of good, but there is still this doom and gloom that seems to be justified and with all kinds of figures and numbers. So if we were just a cold-blooded just equipped with a big brain and a circuitry, like a quantum computer, and could think all of this through, then the only sort of objective correct course of action would just be to hang ourselves collectively and say the earth will be much better without us, so why bother, why sticking around? And nobody does that, of course. Nobody does that except some that react emotionally to these numbers and these kind of, this kind of way of thinking. Because emotions is the only reason why you do anything in reality. For instance, any scientists, the discipline that he chooses and the studies he's conducting are all motivated by emotions. There is nothing rational about it. That is there any scientist that, for instance, says, okay, I'm going to do a survey of all of the different scientific disciplines that exist in the world. Then I'm going to find the one where there's most progress needed because there's the least number of scientists working on that topic. And that's what I'm going to do because objectively, of course, we have to sort of level everything out. Everything has to be balanced in terms of knowledge. And so we have to go and focus on that which we work least on and where there are blind spots. Nobody does that. Absolutely no one. No one sort of chooses dispassionately his discipline. Everybody chooses based on emotions, but those emotions are buried deep down and they're never really aware of them. For instance, when you're working on things like climate change, then your real motivations are about safeguarding a future for your children, are about being afraid of the human condition and, being afraid of dying, for instance. But all of that are emotional reasons. They're not rational reasons. A computer doesn't have these kinds of feelings or thinking about these kind of things. And so all decisions ultimately are emotional. That is, for instance, what makes you pick between two different flavors of ice cream. You never go and check, for instance, the chemical composition of each ice cream, check the number of calories, and then look at your metabolism and see if it corresponds to what your body actually needs, and then only lick the exact amount of ice cream that your body needs in a sort of a chemical, artificial way, and then ditch the rest of the ice cream and put it in the trash or something. Nobody does that either. People act based on emotions all the time, constantly. That is basically like 95% of our reality is all emotional. But also one of the problems is simply that we're just not equipped with this rational kind of, the way that we're taught in school and stuff. We're not equipped to talk about our emotions. We're not equipped to talk about how we feel about something. We don't have the words. We don't have the vocabulary. And the other thing is, in this rational sort of mindset, you're always looking for cause. There's somebody is responsible for what is happening. There's always a cause to everything. Like, for instance, if somebody hits you and then you're hurt and you're aching, then there's a cause and effect. Somebody's responsible. But that is the sort of physical pain signal, which is only there for you to sort of get away from that which causes you pain, but the emotions that you feel afterwards are triggered by you, and they are subjective regardless of what anyone can say. There's no rational way of thinking about it. There's no rational way to answer to somebody hitting you, for instance. There is a sort of an instinctive way of reacting, which is the animal instinct, which is basically fight or flight. And then there is the human emotional response on top of that, which is disguised as rational. And emotions, for instance, some people will feel sad, some people will feel angry, some people will feel humiliated, some people will feel even flattered that somebody paid attention to them. And that is all really unique to the history of how you grew up, how you were conditioned as a child, for instance. That is, I mean, of course, it would take a psycho to raise a kid which would find it pleasurable to be hit, because it's almost like a sign of affection, because somebody like a child that is completely ignored by his parents, and the only time they give him any attention at all is when they're violent with them, might create this kind of conditioning where that kid will feel actually positive emotions when being hit, because that's the only kind of physical contact or attention that he can get from his parents, which is absolutely tragic and sad, but it just goes to show you that that's how powerful emotions are and how subjective they are as well, even when faced with an exact same sort of stimuli or situation. And so all of our decisions basically are driven by emotions, and also all of our actions are based on emotions. And emotions is the subtext that people like clairvoyant people can actually read whenever you say something, whenever you do something, whenever you write a book. There's no way that you can write something dispassionately without actually exposing your emotions unconsciously through your writing. And that is something that most people don't really understand is, for instance, when you're listening to somebody that is giving a speech, for instance, on TV, like you would listen to Greta Thunberg or whatever her name is, I can't remember now. And she will, start yelling at politicians and people from oil companies and getting all upset and everything. And it's not the contents, the contents of her speech, the rational part of her speech is like you have a cake and then you have a little cherry on top of the cake. And you go into the store and the only thing you notice is that cherry and you say, I want the cherry. But you're getting the cake. And what's going to fill your stomach is not the cherry. The cherry is going to be swallowed in an instant, and it's going to be like marginal in terms of what you consume. What you're going to consume is the whole cake. That's what's going to fill your stomach and fill your body. And so when you listen to a speech like Greta, for instance, the contents of her speech is the cherry, and the emotional state that she is in is the cake. That is what you actually resonate with. And this is really important, resonance. So you're going to listen to Greta, and it's her emotional state. If you can resonate with her emotional state, like for instance, if you are also feeling angry with politicians, if you're also wanting to sort of scream at the oil companies, if you're also outraged, if you're also upset about the rainforest and this and that, then her emotional state is what you're going to adhere to and enter into resonance with. Like you feel the same as Greta, you don't really know it because you don't know how you feel, and she expresses those feelings through her speech without sometimes even knowing it. Of course, she's more open about her emotions in the way she speaks than most people, because most people are hiding it. And that is what you agree with. Now take her speech, take every single thing that she says, and have it read back to you by somebody else that feels completely different about and the way that they say the same phrases with the different emotions associated to those phrases. And you'll see that you might not resonate with the text at all. You might completely disagree with that person and say, no, no, that's bullshit, even though it's the exact same speech. And so that's really important. And so that's just to say that, for instance, this applies to me too, of course. So I have a certain vision of reality, which is quite unsettling. Multidimensionality, everything is really complex. Time, space, spirituality, entities, extraterrestrials, all of that is just all. And I'm still, of course, getting a grip on all those things. But it's not the contents that's really important to you, even though you might say, wow, Martin, your insight is really interesting, or your ideas are really interesting, and this and that. But that's the cherry. The cake is, how is the emotional state of this guy that is talking about all these ideas? And the best service that I can do to you, in terms of my ideas, is what I think you're really getting out of these videos is, here's a guy that juggles with very difficult and contradictory concepts that are like the absolute and the relative, like multidimensionality, like looking at things from different vantage points. And he's not in a psychiatric asylum in a hospital, and he manages to sort of go through life almost normally, even though I have my challenges, of course. And he makes it seem like you can actually settle on that kind of new, more complex vision of reality without going bonkers, without blowing a fuse. And then you're saying, "Oh, that's interesting. Um, that's what I want. That's what I'm interested in." If you had somebody else that was saying the exact same thing as I'm saying today, but they were, for instance, living the life of a Buddhist Zen master that is living alone in a monastery, and that is in a certain emotional state, for instance, it would resonate with completely different kinds of people that are also seeking after that kind of state of being, that kind of emotional state. Um, and the same for people, for instance, that are talking about reptilians, like, for instance, what's his name? That guy that on um, like Alex Jones, for instance. Um, Alex Jones. So if you feel, for instance, that there's something wrong with the world, that just we're being manipulated, you feel fearful of all those kind of things, then you're going to greatly resonate with his emotional state of being all panicky and talking, like really, with all those, like, yeah, just very lively and stuff. And you're going to resonate with that, and then you're going, like, the rational, the contents part is something that you swallow almost, um, unconsciously, but what you're actually resonating with is his emotional state and your own emotional state. And so I think that beyond what I'm saying, the best service I can give is, of course, I'm talking about various things, and it's a nice cherry on the cake to talk about content, but it's the emotional evolution that I'm going through, of getting to grips with, who I am, doing, hypnosis and all kinds of regressive therapies and all kinds of other things, to sort of get a grip on, all the stuff that I'm now, on my vision of the world, basically, and making me sound not go like I'm going crazy, basically, like I still am in this reality, and like I'm not going to completely crazy. And that's the most important thing. That's the most important information that you'll get from any video that you watch, basically. And there have been videos where I'm kind of a little bit more on edge because I was kind of a bit more obsessed with extraterrestrials and negative outcomes for humanity and all that stuff. And so my emotional state also fluctuates depending on my own evolution and the topics that I'm talking about. But it's not really the contents that you're going to appreciate or not. It's my emotional state whenever I'm saying these kind of things. Um, and so that's why it's really important to sort of clarify your intentions as well and the emotions that you put into doing things, because they're going to completely alter the outcome of your experience. If you, for instance, build a autonomous farm with positive emotions of hope for a better future and humanity, you're going to get a totally different response from people and totally different outcome than if you do it out of fear that the whole world is going to collapse and making sure that you have enough to feed your kids. Of course, it's not that you shouldn't do one or the other. It's just that you have to at least be aware of it and provide the right kind of mix and seasoning in your own kind of food, because you're the one that's going to eat your own experience. So if you don't put the right seasoning to your own experience, then you might then be disappointed, and you're going to say, "Oh, it's too sharp." Like if you put too spicy, too much spices in your food, you're going to say that's too spicy for me. And that's a shame because you're the one that's ultimately going to eat your experience. You're going to experience life, what you've created for and set out to create for yourself. And so ideally it should be a mix of plenty of different things because we are multidimensional beings, and of course there is a dimension where you want to um, have enough food just in case something goes wrong, but at the same time you should also cultivate the hope that there is a better future ahead of us, because if you only add, for instance, pepper and you have no salt, I mean, it might not be the best food to taste, afterwards when you have to eat it. And the same for your overall experience in life. Um, I also like to have comparisons for emotions on how ideally it should work. Like for instance, if you look at little kids, I compare little kids to like balloons, air balloons, and the kid is the balloon, and the air that you put inside the balloon is their emotions. And when you let the balloon go and it just goes, and then it lands flat on the ground, there's no air left, and it just goes in all kinds of directions. That's basically how kids are, and with emotions. They can go from one emotion to the other, like they can go from joy to crying to being sad to being angry within seconds, and their emotions just they they um they express them instantly, like they just get out of them, like they express their emotions instantly, and it's like this air flowing out of the balloon, and they go in all directions. Of course, they jump all around, they cry, they roll themselves on the floor, or they express their joy like there's no tomorrow, like they're jumping like crazy, and then they're completely empty, like you see that the emotion has left them, and they're like until the next emotion sort of fills them, and then they're going with the balloon again. And that's why kids have such a hard time, for instance, to concentrate on a specific task for an hour, for instance learning piano for an hour, because they just don't have the capacity to use emotional energy, because energy is emotions are an energy. They're capable of channeling it and controlling it for that kind of long periods of time for doing something steadily. Then you have adolescents, which are a bit bigger, like teenagers, and they are like a hot air balloon. So they have this burner that they use. They have a balloon that is filled, sort of. They have this like emotions in there. They have much more control over their emotions, but they're kind of go swayed by the wind, like they just go wherever the wind takes them. they're not really in control of that air balloon. All they can do is like increase the amount of emotions inside the balloon, and then they can just go whoa way up, and then they're just totally out of control. Or they don't put enough air into the balloon, and then they stay kind of on the ground, low level, and they don't go anywhere. Like teenagers, they can be passionate and obsessed about a video game, a project, something like a sport for 1, 2, 3 years, and then sometimes from the day the wind change, like the wind changes one day, and they're not interested anymore. And you know how it is. Like you buy them this awesome poster of this artist that they loved, that they're a fan of, and one year and one Christmas they'll just say, "Oh, I'm not listening to that anymore." And you're like, "When did that happen?" And it's just the winds have changed. So they're very volatile. They go wherever the wind takes them, and the wind is typically, whatever is popular. The social crowd is really important to them, for them to belong, for them to be popular, for them to find a sort of crowd that resonates with their who they are and their interests, and that can change. And of course, there are problems. Like, for instance, many teenagers have holes in the air balloon and they burn themselves out, and I mean, plenty of problems. But ideally, it's just this is the natural state of evolution normally. Like everyone goes through these phases, and then as adults should be like an airship. They should be like an airship that has, these motors here. So your emotions is what carries you, is what gives you the energy to sort of float up, but then you still have some command over them, some control, and you can steer your airship and even fly against the wind if necessary. And that is the healthy sort of stages of development. And then when you're in that kind of stage, then you can really have an impact on the world, because you have this energy and this drive to actually go to the end of your projects, make a lasting impact, or dedicate your life to something like for 10, 15, 20 years, without being swayed too much, without being burnt out like this balloon, just lying flat on the floor. But adults have their own problems, like like the Hindenburg, and the way it I don't know if it's how it's spelled, but like this airship that basically caught fire and completely burned. Some adults are like that, like their emotions, like they're just cramming them in that airship in a very dangerous way, because they're not in like listening to them or aware of them. And then one day they just catch fire, and then the whole airship sort of collapses. Um, and these stages is something that you have to accompany children and teenagers and adults into. And some adults never left the stage of the balloon in some ways. Like they just live their emotions in the moment, vent it out, and then they're drained. There's no energy left to do anything else. Or they're still kind of in the teenager way. They're just like swayed by the wind, and they cannot focus their energy on one thing and stay to it. Um, or they're a dysfunctional airship. I mean, but yeah. So that's basically the process in my mind, as a metaphor. And ideally, we should all transition through these phases, and we need help, of course, from therapists and psychologists and teachers. And this is something that should be taught at school, in order for us to sort of be conscious of all of that, and even for us to interact in a more harmonious way in the future. And this is all part of what I've been saying when we move from science to a new paradigm, going back to the I feel rather than I think is very good, because you're talking, for instance, about yourself. You're not imposing upon others. You're not trying to ask the other person to feel the way you do. You're just sharing how you're feeling with something, in an honest way. And there's no way that they're going to feel like they're threatened in their beliefs, or like they're being imposed your worldview in a dishonest manner upon them. You're just sharing how you're feeling, and you're doing it in a open way rather than a hidden way where you're talking about the rational reasons why you believe something, when in fact you're just shoveling all kinds of emotions upon that other person without you knowing it, and the other person just senses it, of course, because on the unconscious level they will sense your emotional state, and they will lash out at you if they don't resonate with your emotional state. But since they don't have the vocabulary to say it or to even have the knowledge about it, then they're going to oppose your arguments with their arguments, or their rational, thinking or whatever, when it's never rational to begin with, and their response is not going to be rational either. um, Underneath, they're just it's just two people that feel differently about a specific issue, and they're going to disguise those two incompatible feelings with a rational overlay, and they're just not going to be able to understand each other ever. Whereas if you go through this more honest way of being honest about how you feel about something, what your fears are, then a communication is possible because the other person says, "Oh, I understand why you can feel like this is threatening, or you're afraid because of this, or whatever." But um, never if you're trying to sort of impose the way you feel, because you're using this cloak of objectivity through rationality and science. And of course, this is not necessarily spiritual. It's just the way humans are, and about the fact that we are now evolved enough in order to be able to share our emotions without um, being taken advantage of by other people. Um, I think we have the maturity as a society, as a civilization, to that we have reached that level of maturity in my mind. So I hope you found this episode interesting, and talk to you in the next episode.